everybody. It's about the third day into the moon cycle. In Blackfoot, I think it's called Poughkeepsie Otsitsippi. And in case you think that just rolled off my tongue, I had to practice it for 15 minutes like a mantra in an attempt to even be able to remember it, because the phonemic anatomy of Blackfoot is curiously different from that of English. Poughkeepsie Otsitsippi. There's probably a complex way to decode that, but the sound is strikingly unfamiliar. And so it was very difficult for my memory to kind of get a grip on the parts and their sequence. If I think of it that way, that's not the only thing that was happening. I had to also get a grip on the gestalt of the elements. I think a rough translation would be choke cherry moon. Their cycles have a tag, like the choke cherry moon or the flower moon or long range moon. They have tags, but I suspect those tags hide a rich library of associations and connotations, relationships. Again, largely unlike English, which comes down hard on the side of structural distinguishing categories, taxonomies, axioms, and so on. And a goodly portion of that is blinding. It's easy to come to believe the cuts we make to distinguish categories. Can't highlight that word enough there. We make those cuts intentionally, and their produce is the result of our intention, why we are looking, why we are distinguishing. So, with different purposes for distinguishing, we get different categories and different taxonomies entirely. Categories and taxonomies so unlike what we're used to that they would perhaps seem to have come from an alien intelligence were we to suddenly encounter them in our minds. They're the taxonomies of unity, of relation, the categories of unity, where really something like the opposite of a cut is being made, where we unify by distinguishing. Now, of course, the highly structured Western mind category systems also do this. They say what belongs to a category, not merely what is omitted or what the criteria for belonging are. But the fundamental purpose in ancient languages appears to be something quite different from how we're used to playing with the knife of our minds, and can help us to recall that there are different ways of using that knife And one of them bonds before it distinguishes. The other one bonds by distinguishing with an abstraction. And that latter one extinguishes relation and trades it for, convenience. Pokipsitsi, otsitsitsipi. Many of my favorite trees are starting to drop pollen now. Yesterday I saw ants moving larvae. In the previous cycle, there were mating flights, at least among ants. There's a living calendar that is new and informative. If we participate meaningfully in it. And for many of us, that could seem quite difficult. What does it mean to participate meaningfully? And in case it isn't clear, I struggle. It's much easier to speak of something than it is to embody it. Often I can speak of what I can easily see, but only perhaps very modestly embody. Maybe there was always something not entirely dissimilar to news among our distant ancestors. We can even think back to animals. Even with animals in a cohort, there's something vaguely like news. And maybe even somehow something primordial resembling what advertising is the crude representation of was also involved. In the same way that the bee scouts returning from scouting flights compete for the attentions of the hive by dancing. And those they manage to recruit begin to dance like them. And sometimes these scouts have visited the same candidate location for a new hive, but they both dance uniquely. They're dancing about a new home. There's no less trivial matter to be dancing about. They're dancing about the future of their lineage. That's quite a dance. But long before there was news, there was again something more primordial. Something felt. Something invisible, yet everywhere apparent. And because it's easy not to see it for how convincing the physical situation is, most of what's going on is in the invisible world of relationships. And what I'll sketch is the polarity of time and temporalities, right? Different forms and kinds of time, and timeless, both. So the invisible transmissions and receptions. And in case you think I'm talking about something woo-ish, so to speak, I'm talking about the fact that I can't see oxygen. The camera is not picking up any oxygen right now, you'll notice that. The reason you can tell there's some is because I'm alive. So you can't see this really primordially important thing. You can see because of it. Right? Your ability to see is one of the expressions of that primordial thing. And there aren't pieces of oxygen. There's just oxygen. There are other gases, we can introduce them. Sometimes they're introduced. And in fact, we live in a complex mix of gases, not just oxygen, and probably, lots of those underappreciated molecules contribute to all kinds of things about what it means to be able to see or talk, make noises in any language. I actually have to inhale atmosphere before I can make face noises. So there was this primordial thing way before news, or anything like news. That was the felt participatory relation with everything alive on this world and all of their histories. And all the relationships that were happening right now. And you can bet that when the ants are moving the larvae, they're not pandering. It's not an attempt to gain market share. It's primordial. When I walk in a living place, and there is light shining from the sun, as there is now, all of the living beings with their actual bodies receive that light, transform it, and reflect it toward my skin. And every movement that I see is the movement of something alive in the sun, in the atmosphere, in the breeze. All the sparkling, all the dancing, all the birth and death and transformation is mediated, the light that reaches me here, down here near the ground, is mediated by all of the living beings comprising this place, including viruses, including so many bacteria that making numbers about them is ridiculous. All over everything. Those bacteria live in a different temporality, right? So when they receive, transform, and transmit light, there's crucial information in that light that human minds know nothing of. They haven't even really this idea. And what I'm presenting is merely a toy. I'm not trying to tell you what's actually going on, and yet you'll see, I think, you may see that something very close to what I'm describing can't not be going on, right? All of the light that is reaching me here, other than the light coming from the sky, which has also been mediated primordially, the layers of atmosphere, the Earth's magnetic field, bacteria in the high atmosphere, viruses, seeds, leaves floating through the air, whatever. So all of the light that's reaching me here is coming from unique instances of being, endless, inconceivable numbers of them, and inconceivable forms of them. And the big ones look like this stuff around me here, right? They look like recognizable organisms, and they too are instances of living time. And they too, they don't merely transform the light, they transform the atmosphere, they transform the soil. So moment to moment, as I'm walking through this garden, there's this incredible symphony of temporalities, and we're all exchanging light and atmosphere. Instant to instant. A single instant of that time in a 10-foot radius would have probably more transactions than the entire history of human computing. But they're not representational transactions. They're the relationships of actually living beings who by increasing the complexity and diversity of the ways in which they can relate, achieve otherwise impossible superpositions in form, in access to opportunity, we could say in creativity. For humans, this is certainly true. So, though we measure time in seconds and minutes, and we have micromeasures too, but what's actually going on is weirder. Organisms of inconceivable diversity, form, kind, are engaging in this sort of hyper symphony, biorelational hyper symphony. Yeah? That doesn't merely happen over time, it transforms time, it invents new dimensions of temporality all day long, and then joins with other beings across that gap to exchange infinite potentials of mutual benefit. And I'll admit, the physical surface, the superficial thing, it looks pretty calm. But underneath that is a web of relationships so staggering, moment to moment, that I think if we were to get a glimpse of it, it would seem explosive rather than process-like. It would just be like this explosion that kept exploding more explosively, moment to moment. Time. See, if we get the idea of time wrong, if we're too representational about it, if we believe in seconds and minutes and so on, hours, if we really think those are the arbiters of temporality, we're lost. There's no other idea we can get right. The nature of identity and meaning and value, these are all wrapped up with time. So if we screw that one up, which in general humans have really had an amazing go at, everything else we think is going to start out badly confused at best, right? And so I imagine our ancestors, they didn't so much have a calendar as they had relationships. And they listened to the relationships over the cycle of a moon, over the cycle of the solar transformations, right? And they were listening to the fundamental heartbeat from which their own bodies and minds are moment to moment reborn, preserved. The same way the oxygen preserves me now. Those relationships between all of the living beings in nature, from the tiniest to the vastest, those relationships are we don't really have any good word for it. We don't have a category for what they are in English. They supersede categories. The plants and animals, the insects, the microbes, they've been around 50 times longer than us at minimum. And they've been relating in nature all that time, so they're like the living library of the history of life. And sure, you can dissect a frog and learn something about anatomy, or you can make an extract of a plant that produces some medically useful molecule. You can learn something from beetle wings that lets you produce bulletproof armor. That's not the kind of learning I mean. I mean learning about the fundamentals of what's actually going on in and as living beings birth and death, light and time. What is the nature of our being? And nature is the endless library of the answer to that question. But we've lost the purposes that will tend to open that portal for us as individuals or cohorts, even though we still have some remaining toys floating around. So in the living place, in a moment of light, the living beings reflect each other. They reflect light not just to me, but to each other. Yeah? And you can see how, if we only look at what happens to light, right, and nothing else, over a second, there's an unthinkable symphony of reception, transformation, reflection, refraction, that creates a position far above the complexity that any one of those organisms could possibly ever get near by itself. And that's just in light. Now, modern human science will say something like, well, that light doesn't really carry information. It's not, you'll find a lot of people saying that anyway. And maybe they're right, it doesn't carry information. It is information. Though it's surely more than mere information. And probably, were we to get any better idea, light is another one of those things you can make really bad mistakes about, and then after that you get everything wrong. So anytime we can learn something more about one of these key root ideas that inform our experiences and thoughts about value and identity and meaning and kind and likeness and non-likeness, when we can make even the slightest degree of progress anywhere in there, in one of those key ideas like time or light or language or separation or unity or dreaming, if we get any one of those even slightly more correct, they immediately correct the ring of other related key concepts in an astonishing way, an incomplete way, but an astonishing way. And all of the paraphores, the categories and classes of objects beneath them also inherit that correction. So in the same way that if we get something like light or time or birth or death or mother or government wrong, right, it becomes very difficult to get anything right. In a casual way of using the word right, like actually better than before, rather than mimicking better while delivering catastrophe. So these key terms like time and light, they really, really matter. Any change in them transforms our entire lexicon, because the lexicon's all bound up in those, call them superiphores, which means one of the primordial holophores that the category is derived from. And the light isn't just reflecting off of living beings, it's reflecting off of soil, right? Trillions of tiny, like dust. It's reflecting off of dust. So I'm like walking in the bones of Earth's ancient rock as all those little crystals reflect light to me. The fungi, the bacteria, the viruses, each one reflecting light. I'm reflecting light to them. We're both receiving that light. And then there's, the insects and the plants and the birds and the animals, the worms, the whole damn thing. So there was something before news. And the toy that I painted here is not even close to what that something was. I'm just trying to demonstrate there's a sort of almost concrete dimension, right? Where temporalities multiply when you put living beings together, because they're each both participants in a sort of generalized order of time, and locally running at their own rate in their own unique way. They're little bubbles of living time, right, so to speak. So when you put all those together so that they can influence each other and reflect off of each other constantly, endlessly, in time as well as light, by the way, but I'm not going to get into that. It's a little too complex and wordy. No, they're making in each of the domains that they can establish both a gap and a transit across it. There's a new aspect of relation that arises. And that dimension is invisible to our sight, mostly. I mean, we can see things like the flower and the bee, the man and the woman, the sun and the planets. We can see very basic stuff like that, but the vast universes of relational manifolds that underlie being, especially for, embodied organisms, right? Physical creatures. It's inconceivable, the the ever-growing profundity of that over time. So we can feel love or reverence or respect or wonder or awe or attraction or repulsion, but we don't see the underlying origins, and we don't see the transport. So you don't really see relation. To the mind that likes things, relation looks like a bunch of invisible nonsense. And our knowledge systems have been reflecting that position for a long, long time. An old friend. So because our knowledge systems have been kind of reinforcing that perspective, constantly evicting that for which there's no physical evidence into a bubble called nonsense, that for which there's no duplicable evidence, right? As our knowledge systems proceeded in that direction, our minds fell off a cliff. And the between of relation became more and more invisible, more and more filled with transactions instead of relationships, noise-based, so that people seek, rather than the best thing, the least offensive thing. And among many offensive things, that least offensive thing can be quite difficult to locate. Relation became invisible to the aspect with which we conceive and assert validity and reality. The truth of life and being can't be encompassed by words. But if I were to I could point at it in words very clumsily and perhaps naively by saying that it is the field of intimacies, largely invisible, on which the little bubble of our lives and hearts and minds is afloat and is an expression of, moment to moment. Intimacy, not category. And for most of us, the news and the noise has invaded our interiority, so we may be denied and feel denied of the communion of just our own being, our own humanity, our own heart, our own self-adoration, union. It seems to me to follow that if there are beings like us who have minds and who can conceive of concepts and use language and build systems and of reference, then that characteristic, that potential must be a quality of time-space itself. In other words, if you get salt crystals in a glass of water over time, either somebody put some salt in there or the water was intrinsically salty. So the same thing is kind of true of minds and consciousness and organisms and so on. It seems to me unlikely that such beings have no precedent nor likeness in space-time and are mere mechanical accidents. As if there were a world with no beings, a universe with no beings, that sort of coughed and out came organisms. And minds and stuff. Languages and physics and technology, representational animals. I've often wondered why there appears, and I'm not sure this is true, but why it very strongly appears that there's just a single representational animal on Earth, formally representational cognitive like us, that uses language and makes records and does writing and things like this. And I suspect that the incredible hypersymphony of biorelation in the ancient, untouched, frothing with life planet, right, was about to produce a really dangerous thing, right? It was going to produce a superposition where it could look back on itself as if from outside, right? And so, in this fable, there were probably, some small array of candidate species upon whom, one of whom would manage to sort of get there first, or upon whom this capacity might be conferred, right? And I often wonder, why would a living planet produce an animal like us? It's a really dangerous proposition if the planet's a being, for example. Right? And I can think of some interesting answers to that, but they're sort of intellectual. This thing's a little weirder, this fable. So the Earth is about to produce the precursors that will become the capacity for formal representational consciousness in animals. And whichever family of animals gets the most of this poisonous, transforming potion will acquire a capacity never before held by living beings, and around here that we know of. And that capacity has a huge and malignant shadow, because if the wrong polarity of it is employed, it not only attacks everything that ever lived on Earth, and yes, by attacking things that live, you're attacking their histories. It'll attack everyone, everything, and itself at all costs. Even if you put the whole planet on the table, it'll just push the button. Ching. So there was a really serious shadow to this seeming powerful thing. And there is also within the gift beauty and wonder and opportunity to be beyond, far beyond what we imagine as possible for humans. In fact, that's where most of our opportunity is hidden from us, in that beyond what we imagine to be possible. That's where most of humanity actually exists. All the time in a superposition. We just keep collapsing it the wrong way. So, our distant ancestors either succeeded in the competition or got the gift, but there's a question in the fable, and the question is, were they the best choice for the gift in our little fairy tale here of the animals? And I think part of the reason our particular form of animal became this way is our peculiarly articulated hands. But that goes back before, that's still part of the history, right? So the animal doesn't just suddenly get chosen. It's been growing toward a branch moment throughout its entire, evolution, development. But yeah, the animal who got the really important gift, did they want it, or did they realize how it's dangerous in a way that gets more dangerous in new ways every time you touch it? Is that a gift? What if our ancestors actually took on a curse? Maybe because they felt they could carry that curse and save the other beings from it, and from its inactions, from its embodiments. But on the balancing beam, they slipped and fell off toward the side of war and killing and making tokens out of things, skipping over relationships, convenience, declarative language, irreverence. And it's really hard to have reverence for something you can't actually sense or deeply imagine. So if you can't feel the plants and the animals and the living places and the light and the temporalities, you can't get a grip on them. They certainly don't seem real from that perspective at all. But the capacity for something to seem real rests upon them. The capacity for something to seem real rests upon the invisible, is really what I'm saying. It rests upon universes of relationships over time, inconceivably complex, astonishingly vital, alive with intent and purpose and dreaming and memory and intelligence. The capacity for us to determine whether or not we think something is real rests on things that cannot be merely real and are to us invisible. You may think, thus transforming mind and memory. If you imagine something, let's say a small blue stone. You can understand and repeat the words "a small blue stone." And perhaps you can make some kind of an image-like experience in your consciousness of a small blue stone. And perhaps a small blue stone has associations for you that are unique to you. It seems very likely that it would. Or it has no special ones. And it may have unconscious ones, unconscious associations. But what you can't see is all of what I just described. You can't see any of that. You can't see your mind moving. Your mind is what you see with. So you can't see your mind interpreting a sentence. Your mind is primordial to interpretation, right? Interpretation happens within this thing I can point at with a clumsy word, mind. Not necessarily your mind, but mind itself. And it's pretty fuzzy what I mean, but I mean the stuff that collapses into conscious experience somehow, or the stuff that emerges as conscious experience, and thought and imagining, and particularly purposeful things, like when I tried to remember the word. Picky Pete C Otsitzipi. I'm not sure if I got the first one right. I can't see my mind struggling to formulate that word, that phrase. Relation is mostly invisible, and so it's easy to write it off. And once it's written off and we're starving for it, we become naturally vulnerable to the representational token game, where you have things like weapons or cash or power or large stores of food or money or, well, I guess I named money twice, but it probably deserved it. And those two are relationships, but they're relationships with a-relational objects and forces, and they're also relationships with killing. The products and artifacts and machines we use, they require a lot of killing all the time to keep them going. And so, whereas our organic relationships might require a very modest amount of killing to sustain ourselves, the more these invisible relationships are represented, we get all kinds of new ways of killing and means and forms and purposes for killing that just explosively propagate everywhere. Because that game, when we fall down on that side of it, is abiotic. It's not merely a self-terminating game, it's omni-terminating. In other words, that style of being human attacks the substrate of life on Earth, which eliminates all games, right? So it doesn't just attack everything around it and itself, it attacks the basis of the possibility of life here. I hear people say, well, nature's resilient. It's a very abstract idea. It's my own body you're talking about. It's the history of my mind and yours. That's the thing that arrogant bubble of bullshit is resting on and emerging from as it makes that statement, right? It's malignantly overbold. Right? It's like being on a boat that somebody's going to crash into a wall and saying, well, humans are resilient. You know, that ghost-like aspect of consciousness that makes statements like this isn't in the game of being alive. It's in the game of making comments, right? It has no relationship with the history and future of life on Earth. It has a relationship with display behavior in which it parades around as if such nonsense were actually the enlightened perspective. If you see nature at all, you will adore it adoring you. If you don't, there's certainly no way I can convince you to, however fervently I might issue the invitation, right? And that aspect that makes statements like, well, nature can bounce back. That's disembodied, sort of projection of some aspect of the psyche that walks around making disembodied statements like that all the time and, sort of inflating itself tangentially. And, I suffer from similar flaws. I'm just as frangible as everybody. I struggle to learn things that might help me to understand features of existence and thought and language and how humans behave alone and in groups that would be otherwise unapproachable for me. And admittedly, I'm role-playing a little bit, right? Like I feel like a sort of half-insane detective guy, right? So I play at it. And I'm grateful for those who play with me. Maybe together we'll see something liberating and profound, something enriching that returns some portion of our lost humanity to our awareness or experience or relationships with ourselves and others and nature. That would be a wonderful outcome. Thank you.